At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, the pale morning sun hung low over the jungles of Assam, India, casting long shadows across the rolling green terrain. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, just 23 years old, eased his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into a gentle climbing turn. The aircraft vibrated steadily beneath him, its Allison engine humming with familiar reassurance. Painted on the nose of the fighter was its name, Lulu Bell, and just below the cockpit, the number 44 marked the plane as his own. Adair was alone in the sky. Moments earlier, the airspace had seemed quiet, almost peaceful. Then, through the thin morning haze 3 miles east, dark shapes began to materialize. First a few, then dozens. Adair's stomach tightened as the formation resolved into unmistakable silhouettes. Japanese bombers and fighters, flying straight toward Denjan Airfield. He counted quickly. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, flying in disciplined formations. Above and below them, like watchful predators, were roughly 40 Nekojima Ki-43 Oscar fighters. 64 enemy aircraft. And only one American fighter in the air. Adair had flown 43 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, escorting transports over the deadly Himalayan supply route known as the Hump. He had faced enemy fighters before. He had seen friends fail to return. But nothing in his training prepared him for what he was seeing now. For the past 8 weeks, Japanese air raids had hammered Allied airfields across northeast India. 47 transport aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. 112 personnel had been killed. Denjan, packed with aircraft and supplies, was a perfect target. Below him lay everything that mattered. The airfield housed 14 C-47 transport planes, each loaded with supplies desperately needed by Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China. A field hospital nearby treated 63 wounded soldiers. Fuel depots held enough aviation gasoline to keep hump operations running for 11 days. If the Japanese bombers reached their target unopposed, the destruction would cripple Allied supply lines over the Himalayas for weeks, possibly longer. Adair checked his instruments. Fuel, 180 gallons, full internal tanks. Flight time, about 90 minutes at combat power. Armament, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, with ammunition for roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire. 12 seconds. Standard combat doctrine was clear. A fighter pilot outnumbered more than 5 to 1 was supposed to avoid engagement, radio for help, and shadow the enemy until reinforcements arrived. Adair's odds were not 5 to 1. They were 64 to 1. The nearest friendly fighters sat on the ground at Jorhat, 38 minutes away. By the time help arrived, bombs would already be falling on Denjan. He could call it in. He could follow at a distance. He could watch helplessly as the base burned. Or he could attack, alone. Adair glanced once more at the enemy formation. The Japanese aircraft were flying 3,000 feet below him, cruising at about 240 miles per hour, confident, orderly, and unchallenged. They expected resistance near the target, not far out over jungle and hills. That gave him one priceless advantage: surprise. Adair pushed the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710 engine responded instantly, the roar growing sharper as manifold pressure climbed to 54 inches. The P-40 surged ahead, accelerating past 300 miles per hour. He climbed until he was 4,000 feet above the bomber stream, positioning himself to the south. The rising sun sat directly behind him, blinding anyone who might look his way. The Japanese fighters remained focused forward, guarding against threats that never came. Adair planned quickly. Ignore the fighters. Hit the bombers first. Break their formation. Bombers depended on precision and discipline. Destroy that, and the entire raid would unravel. Even one fighter, if used correctly, could throw everything into chaos. The lead group of Ki-21 Sally bombers flew in a tight V formation, 6 aircraft, arranged in 2 neat rows of 3. From above, they looked almost peaceful. Adair rolled the P-40 inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove. Speed built rapidly. 340 miles per hour. 360 miles per hour. The Warhawk howled as gravity dragged it downward. The bomber gunners still hadn't seen him. At 800 yards, Adair squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted together, the recoil shuddering through the aircraft. Bright tracer rounds arced toward the lead bomber, stitching across its left wing. Fabric shredded. Metal sparked. Then the port engine burst into flame. Orange fire blossomed outward, followed by thick black smoke. The bomber lurched violently to the left. Its formation collapsed instantly. Aircraft breaking away to avoid collision, pilots scattering in panic. Adair pulled back hard on the stick. 7GS slammed him into his seat. His vision narrowed, but he held it together and rolled sharply to the right. That's when the sky filled with movement. The Oscar fighters reacted at last. More than 40 P-43s peeled off their positions and dove toward him. Light, agile, and deadly, the Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific. Japanese pilots exploited its tight-turning ability mercilessly. Over the past 6 months, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters in Burma and northeast India. Adair knew the rule: never turn with an Oscar. The P-40 was heavier, faster in a straight line, and tougher, but it would lose any sustained turning fight. His only hope was speed, surprise, and constant motion. The first 4 Oscars came in from his 10 o'clock high, sunlight flashing off their wings. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a quick 2-second burst. The rounds missed, but the lead fighter broke away instinctively. His wingman followed. Adair dove to keep his speed. More Oscars followed, diving, climbing, circling, trying to pin him down. His ammunition counter ticked down, 800 rounds remaining. Below the chaos, the bombers were already trying to regroup. 3 separate formations of 6 aircraft each were slowly pulling back together, attempting to rebuild their deadly bombing Vs. If they succeeded, Denjan would be doomed. Adair glanced at his clock. 90 seconds. That was all the time he had before the bombers reached their release point. He shoved the throttle forward again and pointed Lulu Bell straight back toward the bombers. Alone, outnumbered, committed. And the real fight had only just begun. Philip Adair shoved the throttle forward and dove back toward the bomber stream. 8 Oscar fighters latched onto his tail, their slim green shapes slicing through the air behind him. The P-40 trembled as it accelerated past 400 miles per hour in the dive. The Japanese fighters tried to follow, but they couldn't match the speed. Their lighter frames began to buffet violently. One by one, they were forced to pull up. Adair leveled out at bomber altitude. Ahead of him, the right-hand Sally formation was nearly reassembled. 6 aircraft closing back into a bombing V. If they reached Denjan intact, the airfield would burn. Range closed fast. 300 yards. Adair fired. The .50 caliber tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the radial engine detonated in a fireball. Shrapnel and flaming debris ripped away from the cowling. The bomber rolled violently to the right, dragging fire behind it. Its wingman broke formation to avoid collision. Adair kicked rudder, skidded left, and fired again, this time at the next sally. His rounds punched through the bomber's thin aluminum skin, tearing into the fuselage. The Ki-21 had no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Designed in 1936, it was obsolete, but still deadly if allowed to reach its target. Behind him, the Oscars were closing again. 12 fighters this time. Adair pulled up sharply, feeling the aircraft strain as the G-forces crushed him into a seat. He glanced at his gauges. Fuel, 162 gallons remaining. Ammunition, 650 rounds. Below, the bombers were now 19 miles from Denjan. For minutes. That's all that stood between survival and catastrophe. The temperature needle caught his eye. Coolant, 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operating temperature was 210 degrees Fahrenheit. The Allison engine could tolerate heat, but not forever. At sustained combat power, the cooling system was designed to survive roughly 20 minutes. Adair had already been running hard for 11. He ignored it. Two Oscars came at him head-on, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Their 7.7 millimeters machine guns flashed. Tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. Adair fired first. At 350 yards, his heavier .50 caliber rounds smashed into the left Oscar's engine cowling. The fighter shuddered, then peeled away trailing white vapor, coolant venting into the slipstream. Its wingman broke off immediately. Adair dove again. The coolant temperature climbed to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Below him, two bomber formations had reassembled into bombing Vs. The third group remained scattered, three aircraft struggling to rejoin. If he could break the lead formation one more time, the raid would fail. He pointed Lulu Bell downward and attacked again. 6 Oscars tried to intercept him. He blasted past them at 390 miles per hour, too fast for them to react. At bomber altitude, he leveled and lined up on the lead Sally. He fired. The first burst struck the bomber's right wing root. The effect was catastrophic. The wing structure failed instantly. The outer wing panel folded upward, then tore away completely. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a violent spin. No parachutes appeared. The formation shattered. Bombers scattered in every direction, left, right, climbing, diving. Anywhere but straight ahead. Even if they dropped their bombs now, accuracy was gone. The jungle below would absorb the explosions instead of Denjan Airfield. Adair pulled up hard. His coolant gauge hit 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine began to vibrate. Detonation, pre-ignition, was starting inside the cylinders. The engine was literally tearing itself apart from heat. If he didn't reduce power soon, the Allison would seize. 8 Oscars dove on him from above. This time, he saw them too late. Rounds punched into his right wing. Fabric ripped. Metal buckled. One bullet struck the aileron control rod. The response went soft, mushy. He had to apply extra pressure to keep the aircraft level. Another burst raked his fuselage. Rounds sparked off the engine cowling. One penetrated the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The temperature needle shot past 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam erupted from the cowling seams. His oil pressure dropped. The Allison was dying. Adair chopped the throttle. RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. The P-40 began to descend, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars circled above him now, confident. They didn't rush in. They didn't need to. Then flames burst from the engine. Fire in a liquid-cooled engine follows a predictable path. Burning coolant vapor ignites first. Flames spread forward along the cowling, drawn by airflow. If fire reaches the fuel lines, the aircraft explodes. Adair had seconds. Standard procedure was immediate shutdown and bailout. But he was only 8,000 feet up over hostile jungle, 12 miles from friendly territory. He stayed in the plane. Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff, starving the engine of fuel. The flames shrank. 3 seconds later, he pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, then caught. Rough. Weak. But running. Power output dropped to about 60%. Not enough to climb. Barely enough to hold altitude. Below him, the bombers were turning away. The raid was breaking. 1 pilot. 1 fighter. He had done it. But the fight to survive had just begun. 6 Oscars followed him as he turned southwest toward Naguli Airfield, 43 miles away. At 7,000 feet, his oil pressure fell to 0. The Allison should have seized immediately. Instead, it kept running, grinding metal on metal, surviving on momentum, and whatever microscopic oil film remained. Smoke filled the cockpit. Adair slid the canopy open, gulping fresh air as his speed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The Oscars closed to 400 yards. They didn't fire. They were waiting for the engine to die. The Oscars circled above Philip Adair like vultures. They stayed just out of range, confident now, watching the crippled P-40 Warhawk stagger through the sky. Smoke streamed from the engine cowling in a long gray ribbon. The aircraft shuddered with violent vibration, each rotation of the propeller sounding uneven, like a machine seconds from tearing itself apart. Adair's oil pressure needle was pegged at 0. The Allison engine depended on pressurized oil to lubricate its crankshaft, pistons, and connecting rods. Without it, metal scraped against metal. Heat built rapidly. Parts expanded. Any second, a piston could seize or a rod could snap straight through the engine block. His airspeed slipped to 170 mph, then 160. The P-40 stall speed was around 120 miles per hour. The margin between controlled flight and falling out of the sky was shrinking fast. One Oscar slid closer, pulling up alongside his left wing. Adair could see the Japanese pilot clearly now, the goggles, the scarf fluttering in the slipstream. The man pointed downward with 2 fingers. Land. Surrender. Adair didn't respond. At 6,000 feet, smoke began filling the cockpit again, but this time it wasn't from the engine. The rounds that had torn through the fuselage had severed electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. Insulation burned. Acrid smoke clawed at his eyes and throat. He shoved the canopy open. The sudden rush of wind cleared some of the smoke, but made breathing difficult. His eyes watered. His head throbbed. Carbon monoxide poisoning was already working its way through his system. Behind him, the Oscars backed off. They had decided he was already dead. They climbed higher, circling lazily, waiting to watch the crash. At 4,000 feet, disaster struck again. There was a sharp snap, almost lost in the engine noise. The right aileron control cable failed completely. The aileron flopped to full deflection. The P-40 rolled violently to the right. The nose dropped. The aircraft pitched into a steepening dive. Adair hauled back on the control stick. Nothing. The elevator cables were damaged too. The nose stayed down. Gravity took over. Airspeed surged. 200 miles per hour. 220. 250. The jungle rushed upward. Altitude unwound rapidly. 3,000 feet. 500. 2,000. This was it. Then an idea flashed through his fading consciousness. The aircraft wasn't uncontrollable. It was miscontrolled. The damaged aileron forced the right wing down. The broken elevator cables left the stabilizer stuck in a nose-down position. But aerodynamics worked both ways. If he rolled inverted, everything would reverse. The right wing would be forced up instead of down. The stuck elevator would push the tail up, lifting the nose. The very damage trying to kill him might save him. At 1,800 feet, Adair rolled the P-40 completely upside down. -1 G slammed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision darkened around the edges, turning red and gray. The engine sputtered. The fuel system wasn't designed for inverted flight. Fuel sloshed away from the intake. The Allison coughed, nearly quit, then caught again, rough but alive. The nose came up. The dive slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held it there. The descent stopped. Then, impossibly, the aircraft began to climb. Not fast. Barely 50 feet per minute. But it was climbing. He held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds, fighting the pressure in his skull, forcing himself to stay conscious. His airspeed crept back to 160 miles per hour. Then fuel starvation returned. The engine stumbled violently. He rolled upright. Immediately, the damaged controls forced the nose down again. The P-40 began to descend. Adair waited until he lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. The aircraft climbed. Flip, climb. Flip, descend. Flip, climb again. An impossible rhythm. The 6 Oscars, circling above, watched in disbelief. No pilot should have been able to do this. A burning aircraft. No oil pressure. Broken controls. And yet the American refused to crash. 1 Oscar dove to investigate. Adair saw it coming. He rolled inverted to gain altitude, then rolled upright directly toward the Japanese fighter. The sudden, insane maneuver startled the Oscar pilot. He broke away hard. That was enough. The Japanese fighters had seen too much. They turned east toward Burma and disappeared into the haze. Adair was alone again. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons. Oil pressure, 0, unchanged for 9 minutes. The engine should have been a solid mass of fused metal by now. Connecting rods should have welded themselves to the crankshaft. The fact that it still turned defied mechanical logic. It ran on momentum, on friction, on sheer stubbornness. Adair continued his rolling climb, upright to feed fuel, inverted to gain altitude. At 3,000 feet, then 4,000. Ahead, through the haze, he spotted something miraculous. Nagili Airfield. Runway. Tower. Revetments. Home. But survival wasn't guaranteed yet. The engine coughed again. Smoke still poured from a cowling. His coolant gauge no longer worked. The needle had melted off at some point. At 5,000 feet, he began planning the landing, and realized he had another problem. The landing gear was hydraulic. Hydraulics depended on engine power. His engine was barely alive. If he lowered the gear and the engine quit, he'd crash short of the runway. If he tried a belly landing with fuel still aboard, the aircraft could explode. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine died. Adair reached for the gear lever. Nothing happened. The hydraulic pump wasn't producing enough pressure. Then he remembered the backup system. A manual hand pump on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes to lower the gear. He grabbed the handle and pumped. 1, 2, 5. Nothing. He needed both hands, but letting go of the stick meant losing control. Adair reached behind his seat, loosened his lap belt, and wrapped it around the control stick, looping it through the seat frame and pulling it tight. A crude solution, but it held the stick near neutral. He grabbed the pump with both hands. 10 strokes. 15. 20. At 23, resistance built. Hydraulic pressure. At 28, he heard it. A dull thump. The left main gear extended. 3 seconds later, the right. The P-40 slowed immediately, airspeed bleeding off to 135 miles per hour. Nagili runway lay 7 miles ahead, and the engine was on borrowed time. The moment the landing gear locked into place, Philip Adair felt the drag take hold. The P-40 shuddered as its airspeed bled away, from 160 miles per hour down to 135 in seconds. The engine was barely producing power now, coughing and vibrating, as if each rotation of the propeller might be its last. Smoke continued to pour from the cowling, though the flames themselves had died, either burned out or starved by the lack of coolant. Nagili Airfield lay 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. If the engine held. Adair's vision began to tunnel. Gray shadows crept in from the edges. His hands felt heavy, unresponsive. He knew the signs. Carbon monoxide poisoning. He had been breathing contaminated air for more than 14 minutes. His brain was starving for oxygen. He shook his head violently, forcing himself to stay focused. At 6 miles, the engine temperature gauge, one of the few instruments still functioning, read 310 degrees Fahrenheit. Far beyond the red line. Inside the Allison engine, metal components were expanding, tolerances closing. Pistons scraped cylinder walls. Valves threatened to stick. Any second now, something would fail catastrophically. On the ground, tower operators at Nagili finally saw him clearly. A P-40 Warhawk, gear down, flying erratically, trailing smoke. They assumed he was damaged, but still expected a standard approach. Lower flaps. Reduce speed. Touch down gently. But Adair's flaps were hydraulic too. With the engine barely turning, there was no pressure left for them. No flaps. That meant a higher landing speed, around 120 miles per hour instead of 90. It also meant a longer landing roll. Nagili's runway was 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing in a damaged aircraft required at least 3,000 feet. Doable, if everything went perfectly. At 2 miles from the runway, the engine quit. The propeller slowed, then stopped. Silence. No thrust. No power. The P-40 became a glider. A very poor one. The Warhawk's normal glide ratio was about 8 to 1, meaning from 2,000 feet it could glide roughly 3 miles. But this aircraft was riddled with bullet holes. Drag from damaged wings and extended landing gear ruined its aerodynamics. Adair calculated instantly. His real glide ratio was closer to 6-to-1. From his altitude, he would come up short. He was going to crash 200 yards from safety. After surviving 64 enemy aircraft. After flying inverted for 11 minutes. After nursing a dead engine across hostile jungle. He was going to die in sight of the runway. Then, through the fog in his mind, he remembered something. A comment from training. A passing remark from an instructor. P-40 glide characteristics when inverted. Normally, an aircraft glides nose down, wings producing lift upward while gravity pulls it earthward. But inverted, the airflow changes. At certain angles, an upside-down glide could actually produce less drag, slightly extending range. No one was ever expected to try it, but Adair had nothing left to lose. At 1,800 feet, 1 mile from a runway, he rolled the P-40 completely inverted. Blood rushed violently to his head. His vision blurred red, then gray. He clenched his jaw and focused on the horizon, now upside down. The aircraft stabilized. Airspeed, 125 miles per hour. Descent rate, 500 feet per minute. Better than before. Right side up, he'd been losing 700 feet per minute. It was working. The inverted P-40 slid through the air with its gear hanging downward, structurally stressed, aerodynamically wrong, but holding together. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, a crew chief at Naguli, spotted the approaching aircraft through binoculars. What he saw made no sense. A P-40 flying upside down. Landing gear extended. Smoke streaming from the engine. His first thought was terrifying. A Japanese pilot has stolen one of our fighters. Martinez shouted and ran toward the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position. 3 other ground crew followed him, dragging the gun around toward the approaching aircraft. At half a mile, Adair's altitude dropped to 400 feet. His vision tunneled badly now. Carbon monoxide poisoning combined with negative G-forces was shutting down his brain. He estimated he had 20 seconds of consciousness left. He had to roll upright. Too early, and the damaged controls would force the nose down and he'd crash short. Too late, and he'd overshoot the runway or cartwheel inverted. Timing was everything. At 200 feet, 300 yards from the runway threshold, Adair rolled the P-40 right side up. The aircraft immediately tried to kill him. The damaged right aileron forced the wing down. He fought it with left stick, muscles screaming. The nose dropped aggressively. He pulled back, hard on the stick. The broken elevator cables responded sluggishly. Barely. The P-40 crossed the runway threshold at 90 feet, descending fast, wings wobbling, nose high. On the ground, Martinez tracked the aircraft with the machine gun. Smoke. Damage. But now he saw the American markings clearly. Friendly. He held fire. 4 seconds later, the P-40 slammed into the runway. 7 GS. The main gear absorbed the initial impact. The struts compressed fully. The tail wheel crashed down. Metal shrieked. Then the right main gear collapsed. The wing dropped. The wingtip struck concrete and dug in. The aircraft spun violently to the right, sparks and debris exploding outward. The P-40 ground looped 180 degrees, skidding backward for nearly 200 feet before grinding to a halt. Silence. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. Fire crews sprinted toward the wreck. For 12 seconds, Philip Adair didn't move. Then, slowly, he released his shoulder harness. He stood, his legs buckled. He caught himself on the wing root and climbed out of the cockpit. Ground crew reached him just as his strength failed. They lowered him to the concrete. Martinez arrived moments later with the fire crew. They popped open cowling. The Allison engine was destroyed. Pistons seized solid. Crankshaft warped. Oil pan ruptured. Coolant gone. Every cylinder showed severe scoring. 3 connecting rods were welded permanently to the crankshaft. The engine had been running on borrowed physics for nearly 15 minutes. They walked around the aircraft. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage. 7 in the right wing. 4 in the left. One round had completely severed the right aileron control cable. Another punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third shredded electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. Lulu Bell would never fly again. But Denjan Airfield still stood. And the story of what Philip Adair had done was only beginning to spread. Philip Adair sat on the concrete beside the wreck of Lulu Bell, his helmet still on his head, hands blackened with oil and soot. Medics crouched beside him, speaking calmly, asking simple questions. His name, his unit, the date. He answered slowly, his voice distant, as if coming from underwater. Behind them, smoke continued to curl from the ruined Allison engine. Fire crews doused the cowling with foam. When they finally pried the panels open, even the mechanics stared in disbelief. The engine wasn't merely damaged, it was mechanically dead. Pistons were seized solid. The crankshaft was warped. Oil had burned away completely. The coolant system was gone. Any one of those failures should have stopped the engine minutes earlier. Yet somehow, it had kept running. Word of the engagement spread quickly across the base. At Denjan Airfield, intelligence officers confirmed the results. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back. None had released their bombs. Reconnaissance reports later showed the formation had broken apart 15 miles short of the target, the surviving bombers limping back toward Burma under Oscar escort. 0 bombs hit Allied installations. 0 casualties on the ground. 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift, the fragile lifeline between India and China, continued without interruption. 3 days later, on December 16, 1943, Adair was summoned to 10th Air Force Headquarters for formal debriefing. Intelligence officers recorded every detail, his attack vectors, firing passes, engine failures, and the inverted flying technique that had saved his life. Flight surgeons examined him afterward. Their findings were alarming. Adair still showed elevated carbon monoxide levels in his blood, even 72 hours after the mission. The doctors concluded that during the final 11 minutes of flight, he had been suffering from severe carbon monoxide poisoning, a level that should have rendered him unconscious. Yet he had continued to fly. Not only fly, but fight, improvise, and land. The official report stated plainly, Lieutenant Adair remained functional through extraordinary force of will. On January 8, 1944, at a small ceremony in the China-Burma-India Theater, Lieutenant General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell personally presented 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair with a Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations. Despite severe damage to his aircraft and personal injury, he continued his attack, preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities." Adair returned to operations. He flew 95 more combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group, the legendary Burma Banshees. Over time, his calm aggression and precise gunnery earned him A status, with 5 confirmed aerial victories. On his final combat mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 key .43 Oscars over northern Burma against the same aircraft that had once hunted him. In September 1944, Adair returned to the United States. Unlike many of his comrades, he survived the war. He remained in the U.S. Air Force for 30 years, rising steadily through the ranks. He retired in 1971 as a full colonel. The 80th Fighter Group continued fighting until August 1945. By war's end, the Burma Banshees had destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground. Their cost was heavy, 63 pilots killed or missing, but their impact on the CBI theater was decisive. Their skull insignia became one of the most recognizable symbols in the China-Burma-India campaign. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower. It struggled at high altitude. By 1943, many considered it obsolete. But the Warhawk was rugged. It absorbed damage. It kept flying when others wouldn't. And in the hands of pilots like Philip Adair, it proved that combat wasn't decided by specifications alone. It was decided by courage, skill, and refusal to quit. One pilot, one battered fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. On December 13, 1943, Philip Adair solved the impossible, flying alternately inverted and upright for 11 minutes, landing inverted moments before rolling upright onto the runway. A maneuver never taught, never repeated, and never forgotten. History often remembers armies, divisions, and campaigns. But sometimes, history turns on one man, one decision, and one moment when surrender is simply not an option. This was one of those moments. If stories like this remind you why history matters, why forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true wartime stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in the CBI theater.